A warm welcome to everyone in this webinar, I believe our first for the year. This Philippine Social Science Seminar Series is sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and the City University of Hong Kong. I am Cheryl Soriano. I'll be the moderator for this session. I'm a professor in De La Salle University. Today, we are quite privileged to have our guest speaker, Professor Alan Bernardo. Professor Bernardo is Distinguished University Professor and University Fellow at De La Salle University, Manila. His current research relates to four broad themes: polyculturalism in intergroup relations in intercultural contexts, hope, well-being and mental health, socio-economic and other social inequalities, and sociocultural aspects of learning, motivation, and achievement. Professor Bernardo was elected academician of the National Academy of Science and Technology, and recently a fellow of the prestigious World Academy of Social Sciences for the advancement of science in developing countries, becoming the first Filipino social scientist elected to this merit-based science academy. So everyone, please welcome Professor Alan Bernardo.
Thank you, Cheryl. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for spending part of your Friday morning in this discussion. Let me just give me a minute to share. Can you now see my slides?
Yes, all good, Alan.
Okay, good. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you work done by my research group, which is an interdisciplinary research group, looking at the PISA 2018 data. Just very quickly, I'd like to, the screen acknowledges the funding support that we receive for this work. And to the right of the screen are my collaborators, which is a team of math teachers, English teachers, data scientists, and the psychologist. We have published quite a bit in this area in the past 2 years. These are some of the papers we published based on the PISA data. Now, the motivation for looking at PISA actually comes from the Philippine Development Plan that ended last year, where the Philippines, for the first time, decided to participate in the PISA as part of a larger effort to engage large-scale international assessments for the purposes of not just evaluating the progress in the domains of math, science, and literacy, but also to try to build evidence for policy development in the field of education reform. Now, the idea here is that the PISA data should be able to provide guides into what we're not doing as well as we should be, and ideas on what we are doing right. Well, much of what we've heard so far from the PISA is not good news. So I think those of you who are keeping track of Philippine education know that in the PISA 2018, the Philippines ranked last out of 78 countries in terms of reading proficiency, second to last in maths and science. Now, those of you who are a bit more familiar with how the Philippines has been doing in education, which should not be surprised, because since the initial attempts to participate in international surveys, the Philippines has always been ranked at the bottom rungs. The last time we participated in 2003 in kind of a pilot version of the TIMSS, the Philippines also ranked in the bottom 3. Now, of course, there are a lot of criticisms about PISA in itself and international educational assessment in terms of whether it's relevant and appropriate for developing countries like the Philippines. But we can have that discussion, but we're taking off from this policy decision point that the PISA is supposed to be informing the Philippines in terms of what it can do to improve its educational system. Now, I will not talk about the describing the low performance. Quite a bit has been written about it. If you wish, there are 2 files that you can download online. One is the OECD PISA country note on the Philippines, and the Department of Education of the Philippines has its own report on the PISA and subgroup analysis. And one of the things I want to highlight from the Department of Education's report is the way they see things moving forward. And they focus on 4 major areas of reform, which is relating to the curriculum, the learning environment, teachers, and also engaging stakeholders. Now, those of you who know a little bit about what the Philippine education reform has been doing in the past decades will realize that these are actually not new. These are the areas of reform that have been the focus of several administrations of the Department of Education. So it does not seem like the PISA results has actually nudged the education policymakers to any new areas of concern. It's kind of more like the same old approach from what we see in the documents. I should mention, though, that on Monday, the current Department of Education is releasing its master plan based on its own basic education report. So we'll see if there's anything different there. And indeed, if we look at the Department of Education response, it's pretty much the same thing. Focusing on things that they control, which would be the curriculum guides, allocating resources towards the professional development of teachers and more resources in certain schools, and finding ways to send more resources to particular school divisions. It's not anything new. I should say the only new thing that is kind of remarkable is a set of very PISA-related programs where there are initiatives to train students to answer PISA-type questions. So that goes back to the question of whether this is all relevant and appropriate in the Philippine context. But this talk focuses on an aspect which we think that our policymakers might not be paying attention to as much, and that is the actual experiences of the students who are not doing well. So instead of just focusing on issues of a curriculum and instruction, we wanted to look at the actual experiences, the social cognitive sets, the motivations of the students who are not doing well, because we feel like these are the students that are being neglected and left behind by the educational reform efforts. Just to contextualize it, the PISA involves 15-year-old Filipino students. So these are students in either junior high school or senior high school. So they have been in the system for at least 10 years, and they're still performing below standard. In the most concrete sense, a good chunk of them still cannot read. So what's going on here? In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you very quickly about our machine learning approach and share with you some of the major findings. And hopefully I can spend more time discussing our more social, cultural, and psychological analysis of the results. Maybe we have some time to discuss how we think we should move forward, but that won't be my focus. So I'd also like to contextualize our approach in terms of what is typically done in Philippine education research circles, which is a lot of small, descriptive, classroom-based studies which do not allow for inferences about what's going on in the system as a whole. I think the appreciation should be for the reason why there's an emphasis on classroom-based studies in context is because there's an understanding of how heterogeneous the Philippine educational system is. Those of you who are familiar with the Philippine social landscape realize that there's a lot of social inequality, and that is mirrored in our educational system, where you have some very well-resourced private elite institutions and a large majority of under-resourced schools with large populations, with not enough teachers and resources in many parts of the country. But what the PISA data provides is a very huge, randomly, nationally representative, let me backtrack, a nationally representative stratified random sample. All regions, all divisions of the national system are represented. And there's a wide range of variables that we can look at, both at the cognitive level, also at the personal experiential level, because there's a student questionnaire that was provided. The Philippines did not participate in many parts of the PISA. We did not have the teachers answer. There was very limited data on what we can get from the schools. Parents were supposed to be part of the survey, but the Philippines chose not to do so. So although the data is cross-sectional, if the Philippines decides to keep on participating, eventually what we're going to have is a longitudinal data, which can be a better basis for making inferences about whether certain policy decisions are working or whether there are any improvements in the system. Now, as I mentioned, what we wanted to do in our research team was try to understand the poorest performing students. We do not believe that learning is linear and that the same factors predict learning for an achievement for everybody. We think that there are certain factors that identify poor performance, and what we wanted to is to use data science to try to begin exploring what might these factors be. And I'm not sure if there are people in the audience who are familiar with machine learning algorithms, but what we use in the study are a category of algorithms called classification algorithms, which is basically trying to model whether one case fits a group as opposed to another, using big data to determine which combination of variables best identifies membership in one group or the other. So on the right of the screen, you can see the different algorithms that we tried to use. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, just very quickly that we went through cleaning up data and then training the machine learning algorithms until we determine which among the 7 algorithms can generate the most accurate model. Then we did some SHAP analysis to determine which are the most important variables in the model. And that's what I'm going to share with you this morning. I'm going to talk very quickly about some of the results that we think are important in the areas of science and mathematics, keeping in mind that we were not working with a very wide range of variables in those 2 domains. But in the reading area, because PISA 2018 focused on reading, there were so many more variables we can work with. So I'm going to have richer data to share in those in that area. So very quickly, let's start with science. The PISA set the minimum proficiency standard level as 2, and you can see that over 70% of Filipino 15-year-olds were actually performing below standard. But for purposes of our machine learning analysis, we focus on the poorest performing, which would be those even in the lowest levels of the below standard. And that would be about 40% of the students. Now, very quickly, we selected the 15 variables that were identified as the strongest identifiers. And quite surprisingly, the first set of variables all related to students' knowledge about what reading strategies were. I'm not going to go over each one, but overall, the picture that is portrayed here is that these students who are not doing well in science also don't know what strategies can help them read, okay? Now, you may be wondering, what does reading have to do with science? Well, if you are in a school where there are no science laboratories and there are no activities in science classes that are more experiential and hands-on, much of what goes on in Philippine science classrooms is actually learning from lectures and textbooks. So it's not surprising from that perspective that students who do not know how to read well are also the ones who are not doing well in science. Interestingly, we found that classroom and school experiences, the more social, relational nature, were also strongly identifying poor performance in science. Those who are not performing well in science tend to report very low sense of belonging and low perceived cooperation in schools. Fortunately, they were not reporting experiences of bullying, so they weren't. That's a negative identifier. And they did say that students tended not to listen to the teachers when the teacher was speaking in English in the classroom. Now, this is surprising. The students who were not doing well in science were still reporting pride in their low accomplishment, and they still had rather high occupational aspirations 10 years after they finished high school, but they did have low work mastery. We also found out that they tended to come from families where the parents had relatively higher occupational status, but the mothers did not have a high educational attainment, and they did not have access to smartphones with the internet. So if you put this all together, what we think are standing out is that poor performance in science tend to have unclear knowledge about effective reading strategies, had some negative social experiences, but not bullying. And they were on the whole satisfied with their low achievement. And this is accompanied by a rather low work mastery orientation. They still had relatively high occupational aspirations that match perhaps their own parents' parental occupational status, even if their mothers actually had lower educational status. Now, the smartphone access is going to be found in the other domains as well. I'm going to shift quickly to math, where in mathematics, we decided to analyze the data for public schools and private schools separately, because while private school students tended to perform better than public school students across the domains, in math, this was so much more marked, where in private schools, almost 40% of the students met the standard. But for the public school system, less than 20% of the students actually met the standard. So we did machine learning separately, and we did find some variables that were common. In both public and private schools, access to smartphones with internet, I mentioned that earlier, is a common predictor. Students also who did not do well in math did not expect to complete post-secondary credentials, whether it's vocational or university education. Tended to have parents with lower occupational status, and also did not have metacognitive awareness of strategies to check whether their email was a spam message or a fake email. But we begin seeing differences in this slide, where if you look at expected occupation, the students who didn't do well in math from the public schools still expected higher status occupations 10 years after they finish high school, compared to private school students who reported lower job expectations after they finish high school. So remember, these are the students who were not doing well in math. Now, there were other marked differences among the poor achievers of math in public schools. Students tended to have lower work mastery, lower value in schooling, but repeating in science results, they were still fine with their accomplishments. They did report that they already repeated some previous grade levels, and they were more likely to skip whole days of school in the past 2 weeks. In contrast, in the private schools, the most important predictors was the perception of low cooperation among students in the school, and the students tend to have a fixed ability mindset. They did not think they can improve their intelligence. But their parents were still giving them emotional support. So even if they're not doing well in math, their parents were still behind them, providing emotional support. They did have ICT resources at home. These are the poor performing math students from private schools. So they do have, laptops and devices, but they're probably not using this for learning purposes, probably more for leisure. But they did report attending fewer required periods for mathematics in their private school. So we see, I think the way our team interpreted it is that there are clearly differences in terms of constraints, but in the public school, the constraint might be more related to how mathematics is perceived to be associated with their aspirations, occupational and educational, whereas in the among the private school students, it seems to be more related to whether the resources were being used to learn math or other pursuits of young people, okay? Now, I'm going to try to spend more time in reading, where, again, you see here over 50% of the students are actually very poor readers. This is below standard, way below standard, and we have a richer picture of what's going on in terms of their experiences. The students who are not doing well in reading at 15 years old already do not like reading. They have a negative reading self-concept, poor metacognitive awareness of what reading strategies can help them. They don't enjoy reading, even for fiction or enjoyment. Now we have more variables related to teaching. They do say that their teachers in the English language class tended to have low enthusiasm, and they do get a lot of frequent teacher feedback and teachers asking them what they think about the reading material. Now, those of you are thinking, isn't that a good thing? That isn't this good teaching strategy? But keep in mind that these are students who are bad readers already. So imagine the kind of feedback that they're getting. This is negative feedback. And imagine how they're feeling when the teachers ask them to think about what they think about the material. This is a threatening question from most of them, and not something that is probably helping them engage the reading instruction. A lot of ICT related variables, low resources at home. They don't use ICT in a more interactive manner. Instead, they use ICT mostly for more passive, like reading emails. Consistent with what we saw earlier, we found a lot of low motivational sets, low task persistence, low mastery learning goals, low valuing for schooling, and low expected occupational status in high school. The mindset thing is there again. Most of those who are not good readers at this time have a fixed ability mindset. The school environment variables again come in, but this time the poor readers report more exposure to bullying. May not be a personal experience, but they see it in their school. Again, low sense of belonging and perceived cooperation among students. Socioeconomic status is a strong negative predictor of poor achievement. Okay, now let's put this all together now. I'm going to try. Cheryl, I'm doing okay with time.
Around 5 minutes by now, but all
okay,
good.
I can finish. Thanks. We try to interpret this as the learner being embedded within various social developmental systems. And we focus on the mesosystem, which is, and the microsystem of the family and the school. And we think what's going on here now with the 15-year-olds is that individually as learners, they already come from families with low resources because of their economic status. So these are the poor performing students. And they, even if they, the Philippines, everyone now has a smartphone or a mobile phone at least, but it's being used at a very superficial level, not for interactive learning purposes. And this kind of relates to their, I wouldn't say it relates, but what we also observe is low educational and job aspirations for the poor readers in learning, in reading, but not for those in science and mathematics, okay? I'll try to make sense of that shortly, sorry. Now, when what they're bringing in is coming from their home, what they bring to the school is a weaker motivational set. Low achievement motivation, low sense of purpose related to school, value of schooling is low. Educational aspirations are either low, or if they're high, the aspirations don't seem to connect to certain subject matters like math and science. And they do bring a negative growth mindset, or more, how should I say it, a fixed ability mindset. Now, when they get to the classroom, what do they see? Teachers who are not very enthusiastic, teachers who give them feedback, but this feedback tends to be negative, and they don't know which reading strategies help them when they start reading their modules and textbooks. And outside the classroom, they see bullying, and they don't feel a sense of belonging to the social environment of the school, and they don't see students are cooperating and trying to help each other, and those who are not doing well in mathematics also report skipping school more frequently. Now, what's going on here? We're trying to construct a social psychological environment for these low achieving Filipino students. They tend to come from homes that are not well resourced. And it is also very likely that they come from homes that don't actually model high educational aspirations. Now, they might aim for higher occupational, high status occupations, but somehow those are not constructed in a way that kind of connects with ability or learning in some areas like mathematics and science. Now, when they go to the school, what do they experience? Activities are not enjoyable. Teachers asking them things, giving them negative feedback, feedback that threatens their sense of competence. They already know they're not good in reading, and the experiences kind of reinforce that. And when they go outside the school, the classroom, in the broader school environment, they see a lot of things that threaten their sense of relatedness, low sense of belonging. Students are not cooperating. Now, in a psychological sense, how do they now respond? Now, keep in mind, they also tend to think that they can't build on their abilities, that they have their intelligence or their abilities are fixed. We think that what's going on is that what makes sense psychologically is they will cope by self-protecting and distancing from the goals of school. Now, what does this mean? Self-protection refers to a psychological coping response where instead of engaging the activities that threaten your sense of competence, you actually engage in activities that will preserve your sense of self-worth. So you select activities that will make you feel better. And those activities might be activities outside school. And what you do is that those activities that threaten your sense of self and sense of self-worth, competence and relatedness, you distance yourself from that. And that means probably distancing themselves from what's going on in the classroom and the school as a whole. Now, what we think is going on here is that if we want to try to understand why these children or these young people are not doing well in school, it's a psychological response. They are there in school, but after 10 years, they're already disengaging from the school environment. They're physically there, but psychologically, they've already engaged in a response that distances themselves from what's going on in the classroom and in the school environment, so as to protect their sense of self-worth. Now, why is this relevant? Now, as our Department of Education and educational stakeholders are trying to find a better curriculum and train teachers, what we think is that this may not make much of a difference because the students are not engaged. Understandably, you can try to think of instructional strategies that will make students more engaged, but at 15 years old, they've already kind of distanced themselves. And very quickly, we do talk about some possible interventions at the school level, but what we want to now talk about is trying to understand the specific environments in which these poor performing students are operating. And it might be important for us to understand their own experience, their very particular experience, because as we saw, it's kind of different in public schools and private schools. Unfortunately, we did not have more granular data about specific divisions and cities, but we think that the profiles might be very different if we look at more specific contexts, and therefore we should be thinking about more localized interventions. I'm going to leave you with this slide and suggest also that these social psychological experiences are not just residing in individual students, and I think they do also tend to reflect social norms in larger Philippine society. So I think that to an extent, what's going on in the minds of these poor performing students also are an expression of different models of socioeconomic or social mobility in Philippine society, where moving forward or moving up may not be associated with academic competence or intellectual competence. And therefore, I think we could also look at the results within the broader context of discourses regarding learning and the importance of knowledge to succeed in Philippine society, where there's so many models of people who are successful, people who are celebrated and who are idolized by the young people who are not actually models of academic or intellectual competence. I'm going to stop my presentation here, and maybe we can spend more time talking about what we think our studies are sharing. Thank you very much, and back to you, Cheryl.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much, Alan, for that. I think that presentation gave us plenty of points for good reflection, conversation, and also hopefully in the future, action as well. No? So we've already received a few questions. I have some in mind as well, but let's address some of what I thought were kind of fundamental questions as far as understanding differences in Philippine education at the basic level. So perhaps we could address the first question here, Alan, first. Could you explain the social historical context of the differences between public and private schools in the Philippines? So I guess perhaps not just in terms of funding, but perhaps differences beyond funding that you could speak about? I think you're in mute. Sorry.
It's a huge question. We can identify the seeds of the public educational system when the Americans came in the early 1900s. So there was no extensive formal education system. I think the historians would please correct me if I'm wrong, during the Spanish colonial period, there were only pockets of formal education. So it was during the American colonial period that there was an effort to have a larger scale public educational system. But this was modeled after the American educational system. So many of you probably heard of this, what they call the Thomasites, which are American teachers who were shipped in this large vessel called SS Thomas. And these were teachers who had no training in pedagogy for those who are non-speakers, and they were trying to teach Filipino students how to read English and so on. That was kept during about 40, 50 years. There were pockets of private education in the basic level. This was mostly from religious organizations. So those of you would probably have heard of the oldest schools who were Dominicans and the Jesuits and the Recollects and so on. So it's always been the overwhelming majority of the basic education system has been in the public school. And then there would be like a 25% in the private school sector. Public school funding comes from the government. Government always says that the education system enjoys the largest share of the budget, but per capita, it's actually quite dismal. And the ratio has been getting bigger. That means there's been, in the past 10 years, there's been a bigger shift towards the public school system because the private schools are becoming more expensive for many people, okay? The performance has not always been disparate, but I think we don't have nationally available data comparing public and private schools. But consistently in the past, I would say since we have nationally available data from the 1990s, private schools have been outperforming public schools. Generally, public schools do tend to be better resourced, better funded by tuition. There are exceptions in the public school system, like the science high schools, which does not get funding from the Department of Education, but they do get funding from the Department of Science and Technology. That's kind of a broad sweep. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
Thank you, Alan. And that difference goes for both primary and secondary levels. Is that right?
Yes, quite, yes.
The other question, well, it is understandable that your team looked at the PISA data, right? But I think a question here perhaps wants to understand a little bit more how the PISA was gathered. So perhaps how the questionnaires were validated or how the data were collected, if you wanted to speak quite broadly about that for the audience's understanding of the context of the data that you worked with. And then connected to that is another methodological question. I thought asking about any availability about the parents' educational backgrounds as perhaps a source of motivation or aspiration. So if you could speak around this in the context of the methods. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about the PISA framework first, because that is really a major if, okay? So PISA has been going on for a couple of decades now, and the framework is described as the global competency framework, okay? So this is a framework that was originally developed for the OECD, and then started becoming kind of a global framework for educational competency in reading, science, and math. So there is a lot of criticism as to whether that framework is appropriate for all contexts. And I do have problems with some of the assumptions there. And in a sense, the benchmarks are, if we consider the Philippine curriculum, are not completely matched. Okay, so what do I mean by that? There was a study that looked into the curriculum framework of the Philippine basic educational system and the PISA framework. And the study says, yes, there is a great deal of overlap. The competencies articulated are similar. But I think that's at a very superficial level. If you look at the, because the Philippine curriculum guides are defined in terms of minimum competencies. So in terms of the minimum, there is an overlap. But in terms of the higher competencies, that's where the Philippines has not, I think, fully articulated it. So in a sense, you can question the appropriateness of the benchmark. Now, I don't, in our analysis, we don't engage that, but I think that's something that other educational scholars have to discuss. But when we look at what the poorest performing students are not able to do, regardless of framework, I think you're going to agree this is really dismal. And indeed, as far as the poorest performing students that we analyzed, they're also performing poorly if we refer to the Department of Education's own data. So I'm not sure if I'm trying to complicate the discussion unnecessarily, but I'm finding it difficult because each subject area has different frameworks. So there's a different framework for literacy, for math competence, and science competence. And according to the Department of Education and its researchers, yes, those overlap with our framework. But I do still think that there is it's only at the superficial level. So one could still criticize whether the assessment framework is appropriate. Now, how the data were gathered, this was done through the Department of Education. I do think that the PISA sampling procedure is better than the Department of Education's own sampling procedure. So there was a two-level stratification. School districts were randomly sampled per division. And then once the schools were randomly sampled, students were randomly sampled per school. Okay, so it's I'm saying this because anecdotally, a lot of educational stakeholders know that in the local assessment procedures, sometimes district supervisors kind of game it, and some students are told, don't come on this day, that you will not take the exam, things like that, and that some students are prepared to answer the questions. So but one of the things I should mention, though, is that this is a lot of people have criticized the use of English in the assessment of PISA. But that was a decision made by the Department of Education because they say at the senior high school and the junior high school level, the medium of instruction for math and science is English, and therefore that is why they said the survey was going to be done in English. And that's a big topic for debate for many of us in the education reform. Now, there's so much more I can say about the methodology, but the second question, Cheryl, can you remind me what it was about the parents, right?
Yes, the attribution to the parents' educational attainment as a source of aspiration.
Yes, there is. The PISA questionnaire has data on parents' education, occupational status, both mother and father. And there are others who have actually looked into that connection in a more statistical way. And surprisingly, it's not as heterogeneous as you would expect, but the data are there. I should mention that all the data analyzed are publicly accessible in the OECD. So anyone can look it up and do their own analysis for your favorite variables are there.
Yeah, and I guess the question was, perhaps there was a mention that the mother's educational attainment was a source, can be a source of aspiration, but how about the father's? Whereas
Um,
in a patriarchal society, perhaps, I guess that is the assumption of the question, how
yes.
much does this other thing matter over the other?
Um, you would be interested to know that in international studies previous to PISA, so even pre-PISA, pre-2018 PISA, mother's education is the stronger predictor of student achievement than the father's education. Cheryl, that connects to your point, right? So the mother makes a big difference. And that is what was surprising with the, I think this was the science data, was that the mother's low educational status was predictive of the student's low achievement. So that is kind of consistent with what we see. Um, yeah, in the Philippines, women do tend to be higher educated. So when the students come from families where the mother is not educated, they do tend to also do less well in school.
We got, thanks Alan for that. We've got a couple more questions, but I guess just connecting to your discussion earlier, and perhaps you can clarify in the context of PISA and in the context of your analysis, what characterizes a poor performing student? So
Oh,
what does a poor performance vis-a-vis a better performance mean exactly? So perhaps if you could
um,
elaborate a little bit.
Cheryl, I'm going to try to pull out the depth eds report here, but I'm gonna there's gonna be dead air, so you may want to talk a little bit about the other questions to help me prepare what I'll pull out the data.
Okay, if you
Uh,
could multitask. Okay, well, let's try
yes.
to do that. The other question, um, uh, perhaps I'll just read it straight.
Oh,
No?
okay. I can talk now. Sorry, I just didn't want to have
Okay.
dead air. So for example, let's talk about reading. The poorest performing students, and I'm reading here from the report, what they can do in terms of reading is they can evaluate the literal meaning of simple sentences, and they can interpret the literal meaning of text by making very simple connection between pieces of information within a short paragraph. Okay, so they can scan and locate pieces of information if they're prominently displayed in the text and if it is explicitly stated. Okay, um, so it has to be very obvious in the text for them to understand the information. They will not be able to, for example, make an inference about information that is not explicitly cued in the text, but can be inferred from two pieces of information in two sentences that are not adjacent to each other in the paragraph. That's very detailed. Does that make sense, Cheryl?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, now in terms of science, for example, I'm going to shift now to what they can do in terms of now I think this is more in math, for example. They can solve a math problem only if it's something that they've done before and the context of the problem is very familiar and something that they've done before. And they can solve it if the solution involves a routine procedure that they have been explicitly instructed previously. Okay? They cannot solve a math problem if it requires inferring missing information from something that is implied in other information in the problem text. And that will require the application of an algorithm of a formula that is not routine. So in other words, their processing of a math problem tends to be at, again, a very surface, superficial level and will acquire application of a one-step, at most two-step routine procedure. Okay? They will not be able, at 15 years old, they also have difficulty handling things like fractions and decimal numbers, what they can deal with are mostly whole integers. Okay, so imagine these are 15-year-olds, they're already in high school, and they can do very limited problem solving. Now, you might be saying that you're saying it's a good thing PISA pointed this out. Guys, DepEd knows about this. If you talk to teachers in some of our high schools, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds go to junior high school not being able to read. So this is not surprising. Regardless of your reading framework, they really can't do the basics, and they're still in school.
Yep. Thank you for clarifying that, Alan. And also, I guess the succeeding questions pertain to interventions, and I guess it's a nice time, no, as we move towards the end, to talk more about now the question of how to move forward, but also reflecting on the key social, cultural, and psychological findings of the study. And one of the questions here pertains to well, in some contexts, teachers were highly intelligent and able to vary their approaches according to each student's needs. And so this pertains to an intervention from the side of how teachers should be thinking now about education in the context of your findings. What could be the pathway for the Philippines towards the quote-unquote Finland method of achieving excellence? I'm not sure if, yeah. And in 1975, they required master's degrees for the students. Is that necessarily a way to go, or do you think there could be more variations in the way we should think about how teachers should rethink their approaches to education in this sense?
Unfortunately, PISA does not tell us much about teachers. There's data from the school level about their teachers' professional development activities and master's degrees. None of them predicted students or identified student achievement. We also did, this is a different study we conducted more than 10 years ago. Graduate degrees of teachers was totally unrelated to student achievement. So teachers are a big deal, and they get a bad rap. They tend to be blamed a lot for what's going on. But I want you to also imagine the context of teachers, particularly in the public schools. They tend to handle large classes, several classes from 7 in the morning till 4 or 5 in the afternoon. These classes can have 40 students, up to 60 in some large urban centers. In addition to their actual classroom contact with students, there's a lot of paperwork that the Department of Education requires of teachers, so reports about students' progress and so on. In the public school system, teachers are required to submit lesson plans regularly for their supervisors, the coordinators to check. So teachers are overworked. Okay. What's going on in terms of teacher development activities? I was the Department of Education's consultant for teacher development in the basic education sector reform agenda about 15 years ago. Teachers have so-called teacher development activities, which are also very passive. The superintendent or the division superintendent, supervisor would organize these mass training programs where they will come into a big school auditorium and a so-called expert will lecture on these so-called strategy to improve literacy or to improve math problem solving. And you can imagine no good learning is going on there. One of the smart things that the previous, I'm talking about the Department of Education during the administration of Pinoy Benigno Aquino, was to encourage learning circles within the schools, because that was one of the things that we think work. School development, teacher development activities in the school itself, where teachers talk about what works and what works within the context of the kinds of teachers they have. So that was encouraged during, so that would be 2 DepEd administrations ago, but that was kind of not emphasized, because then what happens is, okay, this is not from PISA, but based on our previous work on teacher development, so much money has been funneled towards structured teacher development programs. So that happened in the previous administration, where a lot of education reform funding was funneled through agencies that were supposed to be running seminars and workshops for teachers. So suddenly teachers were being pulled out of their classrooms, supposed to attend this one-day seminar out of schools, which was an approach that we didn't think was helpful. One, you're pulling away teachers from schools. You're teaching them strategies that are not contextualized. But this is a paradigm that works for some educational administrators. Why? Because they can report that they have teacher development activities. They can issue certificates, and get suspended money. Let's not talk about what that means about DepEd spending money. Yeah, graduate training for teachers has, as I said, has not been associated with achievement. Why? Because it's mainly used as a credential for promotion. Many previous researchers have identified that this actually, they call it uniting. This is kind of because in the public educational system, teachers can get promoted once they acquire 12 units of graduate education courses. They don't even have to finish their master's degrees. You can move up you can get promoted, just show that you finished 12 degrees. So this has become a cottage industry in faculties of education, where they offer graduate degree programs, and teachers will get credits. They don't have to actually excel. They just need a transcript of records, and then they can apply for promotion the next round. Not just the public schools, private schools, it's the same thing, okay? So it's this whole idea of credentialing as a means of showing competence. That's a very Philippine thing. We love certificates. We love these showing proof of attendance. But in terms of what's actually changing in the classroom, I don't think the Philippines has very good data to track whether these initiatives of teacher development actually translates into changing classroom practices. I do think that there's a lot of teachers who are going above and beyond, and therefore going graduate studies. They don't care about their certificates. There are teachers who are doing what they think is right for their children, okay? So, and we're not tracking that. Sorry, Sher, go ahead.
Right, and also, Alan, one of your key findings are the weak motivational sets, right? And I would assume if we were to think about this and think about possible interventions, this goes beyond the classroom. So I don't know if you've discussed this with your team, but I wonder what you had in mind as interpretations of why the weak motivational sets, and how that, I don't know if you have historical inference on this as well. Has the weak motivation, I guess the question I had in mind is that why do people not want to aspire for something like certain kinds of occupation, when I remember when I was growing up, it has always been ingrained, oh, you want to be a doctor, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be, it has been there, but I don't know where it changed. So I wonder what your interpretation of this might be about the weak motivational.
I think, Cheryl, you and I come from families where we're not the first generation college educated. So the upper middle class and middle class families, education has always been valued as a pathway going up. But we have to realize that in a country in which with huge socioeconomic inequality, most children come from families where parents are not the source of higher aspirations for social mobility. I mean, this is not based on my research. This is now me talking on the top of my head, trying to be a bad social scientist. No, but look at the models of social mobility in the Philippines right now. You have to go abroad. That does not necessarily require higher educational credentials, right? But in many communities, you see children looking at their community and looking at, oh, that family now has a concrete house. Why? Because they have a relative who went abroad, who has been a domestic helper or an entertainer, and is able to send money so their family can now build a concrete structure. Okay. Aside from being an OFW, I was kind of alarmed recently to find out that many young people aspire to be influencers and vloggers. Apparently, the money comes very quickly. And that has nothing to do with any kind of academic or intellectual competence. And indeed, look at the kind of people that have been celebrated in Philippine society. Okay, look, we have no problems electing national officials with questionable educational standards, or who have not even finished high school. That's not a problem in the Philippines. You can be esteemed and idolized, not finishing high school at all. Academic achievement is not important in many Philippine communities. I did remember, and for that matter, just to flip it, poor academic achievement is not a problem, apparently, presumably, for many of them. I was in a similar talk with some educational reformers, and I was asking them, do you really think people are concerned that we're achieving poorly? Because maybe it's only us who are concerned that we're not doing well in education. Everyone else is happy. We're fine. We're doing our TikToks and all that. Maybe doing badly in education is not the cause for concern. you know so Cheryl, where is this coming from? uh and to think, like, I know you and I probably come from families that recall where having a teacher was a sign of prestige, right, in the community. If you have a teacher in your family, people look up to you. I think we're in a different time now. And academic credentials, academic achievement may not be valued as much in Philippine society now. And this discourse about 10, 20 years ago, people were already saying things like, ay, magti-teacher na lang. Okay? So the teacher is kind of like, hindi ka matanggap sa, you don't get admitted into engineering or a pre-med course, teacher na lang. So I think that kind of I wish someone would study this, but there are it's kind of a reality that I think many of us don't want to face. But and I do these talks and I do wonder, are people really concerned about how badly we're doing in education?
Well, quite a difficult question to end by.
It is.
But yes, I think it prods, it nudges a lot of asking and also reflection from different sectors. I'm in the field of communication and media, and I guess the question that's running through my head is, how should we communicate this better for the kinds of responses that we might want to elicit? But I'm sure our other people in the audience might have their own reflections and perhaps points for intervention as well. So I'm just checking if we have any further questions here to address. All right, I think none at this point. So Alan, I guess I'll invite you for a couple of minutes. Perhaps if you had anything further that you felt you wanted to speak about. You have about a minute or two.
Yeah, because I'm addressing a community of social scientists, and this is an invitation. There's so much data that points to learning poverty in the Philippine context. There is now the educational commission that our national leaders have decided. This is EDCOM 2, which is an attempt to try to stop the bleeding, so to speak. I'd like to invite Philippine social scientists or social scientists interested in the Philippines to please get involved. There's so much reform discourse in education, which is very tired and outdated, and kind of what I would call stereotypical thinking. You have policy wonks who think the solution is just put more money in this. We need more thoughtful solutions, and I think a richer historical, sociological, a deeper social analysis of the problems of education need to be articulated and communicated to the policymakers. Otherwise, we will end up with EDCOM suggesting put more money in this, put money on that, require teachers to do master's degrees. A lot of the tired old solutions that we know are not working. We need you. Please help the EDCOM. There are many commissions that are going to commission studies We need analytic frames. We need the questions. And I would like to invite the social science community in the Philippines and outside who care about Philippine educators to please help us in this effort. Whatever your methods is, you don't have to do machine learning. Machine learning is just one of those things I do. But policy analysis, anthropological analysis, historical analysis, looking at governance issues, how decisions are made at the division level and at the central level. We need your help because these reforms have been going on and nothing is improving. If at all, things are getting worse. We need help. Thanks, Cheryl.
And thanks very much, Alan, for this opportunity to hear your talk and reflections. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us in this webinar. Until
Thank
the
you,
next.
Cheryl. Thank you, everyone, for listening.